From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to Film Music Live, the show where you get to ask the questions to today's top composers. I'm happy to have you here.
For a composer who started out in the indie scoring world, Rob Simonson ain't afraid of no ghosts, let alone of taking on the proton packs of a major symphonic blockbuster like Ghostbusters' Afterlife. It's a score that's as wonderfully possessed by original composer Elmer Bernstein as it is Simonson's own frightfully fun voice that's sure to delight any OG Ghostbusters fan as it is to enchant the next generation to the power of symphonic thematic scoring. Keyholder Michael Dana powered up Simonson's rising career with additional music for the likes of Surf's Up, Moneyball, and Life of Pi before co-scoring the romantic hit 500 Days of Summer. Simonson was on his own path with innovatively hip scoring for the spectacular Now, The Way, Way Back, Nerve, and Going in Style. He'd also show darker orchestral inclinations with Foxcatcher and All Good Things, as well as sumptuous soaring romance for The Age of Adeline. When it came to horror, Simonson has given a terrifyingly offbeat sound to the monsters of Master Cleanse and Viral, while also hearing youthful superheroics with Fast Color. Now, those two genres cross the streams for Simonson with his biggest profile project yet for the long-awaited Ghostbusters Afterlife. Drawing its ectoplasm from Elmer Bernstein's iconic themes, Simonson brings new energy to kid Ghostbusters in the middle of nowhere who have to quickly grow up to fill the last team's shoes as they take on the spooks besieging their small town. But leave it to Simonson's epic orchestral forces, scary fun suspense, and most of all in conveying the excitement of harnessing hellish legions to show like never before that he's got the ectoplasmic stuff to bust into a whole new world of tentpole Hollywood scoring.
And now here, and ready to tell us how Elvis is, and if he's seen him lately, is Rob Simonson. Welcome to Film Music Live.
Thanks, man. It's great to be here.
So, I think when I think about it, this is close to Rogue One in a way where, Michael Giacchino took all of the ideas of John Williams and made it into his own thing while also, referencing John Williams. But here, it's just how wonderful the ghost of Elmer Bernstein is alive in addition to your own scoring. Was this always the first choice as to how to score Ghostbusters Afterlife?
Yeah, it definitely was. Jason, the first thing that he said was that I needed to kind of put my own voice aside and really carry forth the musical legacy of the original Ghostbusters and Elmer's themes. So I knew right off the bat what the directive was. And the questions that we had after reading the script were, how do we do the thrilling action and arguably larger set pieces? So we kind of dialed in on focusing on the spirit of mid-80s action adventure films, E.T., Goonies, Back to the Future, and thinking about how do we take Elmer's themes and material and kind of do an homage to that spirit, kind of do it in a style of that kind of youthful wonderment and fast-paced excitement. In the original, there's really not much. You kind of go from comedic music to either creepy music or maybe romantic music to apocalypse. And there's not a whole lot of action music. And I think for some of those scenes, they ended up cutting in pop songs. So that was really the thing that we had to figure out.
Now, I imagine you're probably a kid when Ghostbusters first came out. I mean, do you remember what your reaction was to seeing Ghostbusters for the very first time and what you thought about the music in it?
Yeah, I was 8 something, 7 or 8, and it was one of the first films that really creeped me out, actually, because a lot of those other films, E.T. was actually really creepy for me when I was a kid. Um, it's interesting what can kind of make you creepy, but I was really creeped out by E.T. Even though I loved the film, I used to have nightmares about E.T. trying to come and get me. Um, and I remember the first scene in the library where the librarian turns into a legitimately scary looking ghost. And I was like, wait a minute, what is this? It's kind of funny, but it's also kind of scary and it's creepy. And so I didn't really know what to make of it, but I knew that I liked it. And so I watched it a lot growing up. And those chords, those Elmer Bernstein chords were terrifying. They were these, uh, you're it's just very high instruments, very low instruments. The entire orchestra is just playing these very apocalyptic sounding chords, and they're just unsettling. And they were strange harmonies to my ears. There's a lot of augmented chords, which they create a lot of tension. And just the way that they moved were just kind of strange. And then there was comedic stuff, and in the original, those things they come right up against each other. So you've got this quirky stuff, and then suddenly it's just bum bum bum, and it was a little jarring. But I just remember loving the film, and it was just loving Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd and all the guys, and I think it's just one of those that's really stood the test of time for a number of reasons. But the film really still holds up.
Now, I saw that Peter Bernstein was, I guess, a consultant on the score.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Peter was he orchestrated on the original with his father, and so we knew very early on that we wanted him to be involved, even just kind of spiritually involved, just to be with us as part of the brain trust. And so I went and did a demo. Before I got the job, I did a demo for Jason that we recorded with a full orchestra at Warner Brothers, which is where they recorded the original, albeit the stage was different when they recorded it back then in the mid 80s. They've since kind of changed where the control room is, and so the shape of the room is different, and thus the sound of the room is a little different, but still that's where we went. And I had Peter orchestrate that, and it turned out great. And so he stayed involved, and we would when we were getting ready to do the orchestrations, and when we were doing the orchestrations, Peter and I would both look them over, and Peter was just such a wonderful resource, not only of knowing what his father would have done and what they did on the original, but Peter is a accomplished composer, a fantastic composer in his own right, and did a lot of stuff in the 80s. So there were plenty of times when he would say something like, back in the 80s, what we would do is this or that. And whether that was kind of wearing a production hat in terms of how we would record these things or mix these things, or if it was from a more compositional standpoint. But I loved it. I loved having him involved. And we actually just wrapped up a week of recording on another project where I hired him again as orchestrator. So we really got along.
No, that's great. I mean, on Peter's end, I have to give a shout out. Ellie's Story just came out in Blu-ray. Wonderful score by Peter Bernstein. Get the Blu-ray. Now, obviously, Peter had worked on the original score. How did you want to decide? Okay, here's Elmer's theme. Here's my thing. Here's Elmer's thing. How did you block it out like that, where you would go from familiar themes to the new material?
Yeah, so it was. Jason, I think, knew that because we were dealing with characters. I mean, I guess it's out. I don't want to give spoiler alerts if you haven't seen the film, but returning to certain characters from the original, it made sense that if they had certain themes or certain music, that we would use that again. So I think that was a pretty pretty solid conclusion from the beginning. One of my thoughts was, what if that dun 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 that you hear a lot of it, that's just kind of the quote in the original score. It goes on and develops in some of the cues, but you hear those three chords quoted a lot. And I started thinking, well, what if that felt like it was part of a longer phrase? And a lot of times we ended up just quoting the original. In fact, re-recording some of Elmer's compositions, in some cases not even changing anything. And Jason just cut those score pieces into the original, into the film, and he just loved it. So he didn't want me to touch it. He felt like, no, this is canon, this is sacred. So there are some cues that just show up straight from the original score. There are other cues where it might start with an Elmer cue, and then I kind of take over and go forward. Or sometimes it's just taking his themes and kind of riffing on them, or even repurposing them. You hear throughout the film at the beginning, and especially at the end, you hear kind of a heartfelt rendition of the melody, and the chords are different, and the orchestration is different, and that was really fun. I mean, when the burden is not on you to come up with a theme, and you've got a great theme, and you can just kind of riff on it, it's a pleasure.
Now, did Peter actually break out the paper score? Like, did you actually have like the physical score in front of you to study?
Yeah, so Peter has done a lot of these live to-film concerts of Ghostbusters music. So he knows the score incredibly well. He's been touring around the world doing that for years. And so he had the scores as we're prepared for these live performances. So I had those to look over, and then shout out to Omni Publishing, who's doing a fantastic job at putting out scores. They had put out Ghostbusters, so I had that as well. And sometimes it was really handy to cross-reference, because it would show up slightly different between those scores. But I'm here in my studio now, and you can see this is my workstation here, and right here next to where I write. For a year, I had the Ghostbusters score open, and I was just poring over it and checking how he did things. And it was really, I knew that taking this job would be kind of like going to school and just spending a lot of time not just studying Ghostbusters, but studying action adventure scores from the 80s, looking at the scores to those films, as well as just watching them. I think was also a really important part, just to kind of understand the spirit of how these scenes kind of felt, and I think we knew that we were trying to scratch at some of those similar feelings. So it was really wonderful. And this was going back to films that I grew up with and scores that I grew up with, and they were so influential for me and so inspiring to me. So there was a lot of just having my head in scores, and also classical scores as well. William Walton, I had a lot of time, a lot of my head in some William Walton.
So again, if you're watching this interview, please send in your questions for Rob. And this actually leads us to our first question, which is from Louis Virtullini. Hey, Rob, I'm a big fan of your work and love the score for Ghostbusters Afterlife. Besides paying homage to Elmer Bernstein, did you draw any other inspirations from other composers like Vic Mizzy or some other composers, past or present, like William Walton, as you just mentioned?
Yeah, William Walton, Prokofiev, Stravinsky. Prokofiev is one of my personal favorite classical composers. Love of Three Oranges and Lieutenant Kaiji or Kija. I'm not actually totally sure about how that one is properly pronounced. Peter and the Wolf. I mean, Prokofiev is just his classical symphony. I could go on, and you know, look, the titans of the '80s: Goldsmith, Williams, Horner, Silvestri, Craig Safan, Last Starfighter, and you know, even and some other scores that Peter Bernstein did were the Ewok films, which I just saw show up on Disney Plus, and I'm gonna kick back one of these nights and watch that. You know, those composers that could really get this kind of flight of fancy feeling, the soaring feeling. You know, they were definitely all influences for me writing this score. And this score is my love letter to those scores. It's a love letter to, you know, mid 80s action adventure scores and to all those names that I just named. I should also shout out to Aaron Copland, who I feel like Bernstein was also very inspired by. So there was also a bit of, well, who was Bernstein inspired by? Who were these other guys inspired by? And to go back and look at them. And you can hear in a lot of those guys' work, you can hear where they're drawing from, the classical canon. And so it was also a good musicological study to try to find these touchstone parts and to go deeper into some of the works of some composers, their lesser known works. And it was lovely. And I think especially during lockdown with work slowing down, I had a lot more time to do that study. And I know that the pandemic has been hard on a lot of people, and it was hard in some ways, but I really appreciated having a lot of alone time to spend listening and studying.
And this really was one of the first kind of major scores that, you know, kind of came. I mean, it was going through pandemic, but this was kind of really one of the first scores, I think, of at this kind of level that kind of showed, okay, we can do this. How was that whole experience of kind of recording this? It sounds terrific.
Thanks. Well, it got split up. We did a recording session in March of 2020, right before lockdown. And then we didn't know what we were going to do. We had to figure it out. We didn't know. I mean, nobody knew anything back then. We didn't know how long it would last. We didn't know what it would be like to record. So we were exploring all options, like what happens if we can't record and we have to release the film? Is it going to be, you know, a MIDI score, which I was terrified at that notion, but if Sony had to put it out and that's what we had to do. So, you know, we really explored all options, and then the release date kept getting pushed back, and that gave us some breathing room. And then sessions started to happen here in LA. So I felt encouraged by that. And then we came back in October of last year, so a year ago, and had a week of sessions at Sony. And because of COVID proximity rules, we had to split up the orchestra. So when we did it in March, some of the cues were with the whole band all playing in the same room, but most of the score was what we call striped, which is just bringing the section. So the brass by itself, and then on other days it would be strings and winds, harp and piano, and piano and harper in an ISO booth, and then we piece it together. And they're so good. The musicians here are so good that they sound like they're all playing together. But it does make the process a little more tedious. But I think we did all right with the final result.
Now, one thing I really like about this Ghostbusters, it has its own rhythm. The original, it's a bit of a lighter film. And it's just kind of hell's a poppin' and fun from the word go, and it doesn't stop. But this takes a kind of a more measured approach where things kind of build. It doesn't like immediately throw ghost and hijinks in your face. It kind of has to build to a point where it seems like it's halfway through the film where you have your first battle with your ersatz Slimer, who's the metal spitting ghost. Mm-hmm. How did that play into the score? This kind of a much more kind of character oriented Stranger Things approach to the film.
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the things that Jason and I knew that we needed to figure out was the tone of these kids kind of getting introduced to this mystery and these people and events that happened decades ago, and they're at this house and strange things are happening, and they're discovering the car and discovering things. And so I wrote some sketches that had more of a spooky, mysterious wonderment, and Jason loved them, and one in particular, and he just started cutting it all over the film, and had a hard time letting me come back and redo them to picture. So he loved them that much. And that's the high piccolo figure, da, 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 da. And that was something that just showed up in one of my sketches, and Jason really glommed onto that and thought, this is great. This is the sound of Egon and all this. And so that little motif, which was never intended to be a big theme, ended up becoming a big theme. So I took those notes and kind of crystallized them. And then that turned into basically the Spangler theme, which you hear kind of broadly played by the whole orchestra at the end and at other points. So, it was just mostly sketching was how we kind of arrived at that stuff, sketching away from picture and then just giving it to Jason and letting him cut it in, which is what he likes to do. So yeah.
So how were you brought into Ghostbusters Afterlife in the first place?
So I had done Tully and the Front Runner with Jason, and we had a great time. And he was happy with those scores, and I was happy with them as well. And we had become friends. And he called me up and said, "I'm making a Ghostbusters movie, and come read the script and let's chat." So I went to Sony and sat in a room and read a script, and then we had lunch and we sat down and talked. And he told me his vision, and that he didn't want it to sound like a big modern comic book score, or a big kind of modern action score. I think our rule was, no cello ostinatos, which there are, but they're in more of an 80s kind of character where it's not just like da 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 da. So that was one of our rules, and Jason was pretty clear about that, and clear that this wasn't about, bringing in a lot of modern synths and a lot of modern sounds. So then I said, I get it. And I think I can do this, but just to make sure for both of our sake, let me write something. So I wrote something, and I remember getting a call from him, and he just said, "How did you get it to sound like 84? How did you get it to sound so 80s?" And, it was a combination of things, but I knew then that we were on, and then we were off.
Now, I really love the character of Phoebe, and it's never like explicitly done in the film, but her character is essentially autistic. How did you want to approach that? I guess musically delicate, to show that there was something kind of off from her compared to her peers.
Yeah, I mean, McKenna does such a good job of that I feel like the music didn't need to do too much. But I think that's one of the things that figure kind of did. It's this strange little angular thing, and you first hear it on winds and shows up on piccolos throughout the score. And I think it's got, because it's played on winds, it's got like a delicateness and maybe a childlikeness. And there's also an angularity to a lot of wind instruments, especially like the oboe or the bassoon, where the sound has a real point. And so having this kind of this strange scale that this melody is based off of, I think, I think it does something to kind of feel a little awkward somehow. And Egon was that as well. It's a personality type, an introvert and a very brilliant mind. And so I think really it was just finding that right phrase and then not trying to say too much, because McKenna did such a good job of acting with the role. So the burden wasn't really that hard on me.
So I guess when this is a real giant leap for you, even though you've done some pretty big Hollywood movies like Going in Style, Age of Adeline, but were you ever kind of worried about like the kind of this kind of next level blockbuster, like that if you could do it?
Yeah, I think that was why I suggested to Jason, let me write something, because I wanted to prove to myself, I've been eager, I feel like I've been thirsty for big opportunities, to flex. I love doing indie films. I love doing things that are really restrained, but coming from the mid 80s and hearing these scores, it's like, I think it's so many composers' dream to be able to have those kinds of forces and use them in that way where you can really write. And I remember how different it felt when I put the music in front of the musicians and we had the recording sessions and they were playing it. Because when you play stuff that's kind of idiomatic for them, that's the kind of playing that you see in classical music, they've trained for that their whole lives. So it's funny, on a lot of my scores where things are really restrained and they're really delicate and everyone's playing super quiet, we work really hard to kind of get it right, and there's a lot of takes and there's a lot of explaining about what the sound should be. And this, even though there's 100 times the amount of notes on the page, or 1,000 times, they just play it down and they knew what it was. And I think that when you're writing idiomatically for an orchestra and you write things that they've practiced playing, it sounds better. So they, I think, really played it well. And it was very interesting from that standpoint.
Who are your favorite Ghostbusters characters or lines, from the original, and I guess, from this one? And did that, like, what, in terms of playing them, like, you kind of realize the big musical moment, as it were?
Yeah, there was, lines from the original I quote all the time. One of them is, so next time someone does X, Y, and Z, then you say yes. And I say that a lot to my friends and to other people. Sometimes they get the reference and sometimes they don't. Or where do those stairs go? It's like, up, they go up. And, or like, quiet, do you smell something? It's so good. There's so many good lines. So many good lines. And I think in this one, there's a lot of great one-liners in this one too. Podcast really steals the show for me. I love podcasts so much. And I think from the original, Venkman is, he kind of is chewing the scenery, and Bill Murray is in a lot of his films. He's just like that. But I think Rick Moranis is actually my favorite from the original. Louis Tully is just, I quote him a lot too. Large and moving tour. And so I would say Rick Moranis.
Well, hopefully they'll get him in the next one. I was like, where's Rick Moranis?
Fingers crossed.
Now, obviously, you really kind of came up under a terrific composer, Michael Dana. You worked on Life of Pi, which you won an Oscar for. What was that experience like, kind of, I guess, getting your chops to go into a bigger world, as it were, with Michael?
Yeah, when I started working with Michael, he wasn't doing a lot of the dramedy stuff that we ended up doing together. He was doing dark dramas, and some of it was big orchestral stuff, and some of it was smaller orchestral stuff, but definitely darker and more dramatic. And then he worked on Little Miss Sunshine. And after that, 500 Days of Summer came through, and I never really saw myself as doing those kinds of films. So when the opportunity came to do 500 Days of Summer, I was like, well, sure, it's an opportunity, but I don't know, what's indie music? I think I had to learn. And then there was a whole world that opened up. You know, I discovered Nick Drake, and Nick Drake's, you know, Pink Moon is one of my touchstone records. Definitely a touchstone record in terms of what I want guitars to sound like when I use them in scores. And so, you know, it's did a lot of digging on exactly what kind of guitar he played and how he played it and what kind of mic they used. And at the end of the day, you know, it's never about the mic, it's about the player and the playing. But there's still something to be said for mics and where they put it and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so I was really excited when Michael got Life of Pi and to work with him on Moneyball, to do these kind of, you know, larger force things. And even though I started to branch out with things like All Good Things and whatnot, and I did use big orchestras, you know, a lot of calls came through for smaller stuff and ethereal stuff, or kind of synth hybrid stuff, which I love doing. And I think I've kind of found my way through those films and gravitated to what I like. But I mean, anytime you put music in front of musicians, it's extremely exciting. It's humbling, and I just get full of gratitude. And there's no feeling like having a room full of beautiful, virtuosic musicians playing your music. I mean, it's I get freaked out all the time with imposter syndrome, but it's a thrill. It's a thrill, and it never gets old. And I just feel so lucky to be able to do it.
Wow. Now here's a question from Dale, and he is a big fan of your Reverie solo album. Are there any more things like that in the works? And is that the same piano heard throughout Foxcatcher? It's an amazing piano sound, as is the
Wow. Thank you. Yes, I do. I've been quite busy this year, but I do have plans to do another record. And thank you so much. I'm glad that people are finding that. And though that piano, that whole record was recorded in France, in Paris. So those pianos are not here. Foxcatcher, we actually recorded, oh gosh, in New York and in London and in LA. And some of that is me. Some of that is me at Conway Recording Studios. Some of that is me at Sony. But as you can see behind me there, this is a Bösendorfer, which I found several years back and have been driving my piano tech crazy, rehabbing. It didn't really need a rehab, but just taking to another level. And you can hear that piano, you can hear that on the Front Runner and the Way Back. I think pretty much all of the piano on the way back was this piano. But the team that I had in France was so awesome. The engineer Stan Neff and my co-producer Raphael Ambourget, who's actually the son of France Gall and Michel Berger, who are these French pop luminaries. He owns a studio in Saint-Germain in Paris, and I got hired to do a French film, and I went there and worked in the studio for a month, and we became like brothers. And I came back and worked on Reveries with them. and I would like to go back. So, the pandemic kind of dashed some travel plans to going to Europe, but I hope to be getting there actually in the spring. So hopefully before too long, I'll be able to put out another record.
No, very cool. I mean, I think, one of my favorite things, I've been in LA to, and it's kind of like an only in LA event, was this amazing kind of event that you did at this mansion up in the hills, where you would go from like one room to the other and sing all these different composers. You in one room, another composer with crystal glass in another room. Do you think you would want to do that again? I mean, now that most people are vaccinated, that you would kind of maybe do a scale down version of that.
Yeah, we have a couple things planned, actually, not officially yet, but we have concepts, a few different things actually that we want to do. And I'm very, very excited about these ideas. I think they're some of our best yet, actually. And we talk all the time. We're working hard. These things are difficult to put on. They're difficult to fund. They're difficult to schedule. But they're so rewarding, and so many good things have come from it. So yeah, the Echo Society is still alive. It's been a few years since we've done something, but we hope that in 2022 we will be out in the community again, and bringing people together and making music together.
Now you kind of had your 1-2 punch in 2013 when you had the Spectacular Now and the Way Back come out, which were again this kind of really cool synth rock hybrid youth sound that was kind of really coming to fruition, especially with you at the head of these movies. You've done several like them, like House of Tomorrow, where you again, they're all very individualistic, eccentric scores. What's kind of like being part of that wave for you? Again, that kind of hip youth teen angst thing going on.
I mean, I think a lot of it just has to do with the kind of films that I got hired to do. So 500 Days of Summer, and then after that there was The Way Back and Spectacular Now. And I think that when you get temped into an edit, that I think when you put the kind of music that you put out into the world often kind of dictates what opportunities you get. So, I just was listening to interesting pop music and going to interesting concerts, and have a lot of friends that are artists and make amazing music that I love so much. And so I just let myself be inspired by that. And I think that anytime that you get a film score, anytime that, look, every day that you wake up is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to invent the day, invent yourself, connect to something that makes you feel something, and dive into that, and hopefully mining into that feeling for yourself and whatever that material is, whether it's music or writing or whatever you're into. This is it's an opportunity to go as deep into that as possible, and then have fun, just see what's possible and play around. So I think it's great. I think it's cool, and I hope to continue evolving. And studying Elmer Bernstein, one of the things that came through was how he had so many different decades. He was known for being the drama guy, and then he was known for being the Western guy, and then he was the comedy guy, and then the Bible apocalypse guy. And I think that a lot of composers get typecast, and that's one of the things that I love about film composing, is that every film is totally different. It's a new opportunity, and you don't get that quite as much if you are in a band and you have a brand, and then you have an audience that expects certain things from you. You have to manage that burden of the expectations of your fan base. Not that they should ever dictate. Hopefully, you can introduce people to something new, but I don't envy a lot of people in bands that feel like they have to cater to what sells. So I'm happy as a clam being in my studio, and I always try to react to the material. If it's, we're going to do, like in Going in Style, for instance, that was my chance to kind of give a little homage to Lalo Schifrin, who I love so much. And, Nerve was my chance to tip the hat to synthwave. And hopefully every time I do it, it's me, it's me responding. And my hope is that, that people that might listen to my work can hear me in that. But I'm not really thinking about that too much. I think that I know the chords that I like. I kind of do them over and over again because they sound good to me and they feel good to me. So I just keep going, and I'm not afraid to go into any genre. I think it's always an opportunity to ask yourself the question of, how can I do this in a way that is authentic to me, that resonates with me? And maybe that's something very different, or maybe that's not very different. And I think with Ghostbusters, this was me giving an homage to a very established canon of scores and of films. And it was daunting, but I liked that. I liked the challenge. And I said, I want to do this right. I want to give a proper love letter, and I'm going to let myself be deepened by that process. So every film score that I've done has been that. I always walk away better, I think. And I think that's kind of, in the end, that's the main goal, is just to progress.
For me, as a longtime fan, particularly of your indie work, I think a score that really showed me and a lot of people that you could, again, take the next leap into this beautifully lush orchestral scores. And I know it's a score that Louis loves, is The Age of Adeline. Really one of the most gorgeous romantic scores that I've heard in many a moon. What was that experience like of again, going to that next level there?
It was great. I mean, when you have a film and you have a direction and you have a director who has a vision, it's really great. And that's like a feeling. They're trying to go for a feeling, and so they can kind of give you a pathway to go forward musically and push into that. And I love ambient music. I love ethereal music, and I love film scores. And I was talking with Matthew Sweet. They asked me about a score that influenced me when I was coming up, and I said Braveheart from James Horner. And I went to a very non-traditional high school, and so our PE was actually, I was taking a Qigong class. So you're doing kind of these moving the energy around, flowing movements. And he put on Braveheart, and I hadn't seen the film yet. And of course I knew who James Horner was, but I hadn't heard the score and I hadn't seen the film. And there are passages in that where the strings are just so lush and so beautiful, and they have this kind of spiritual quality to them. They did for me. And I just remember that feeling. And that was a feeling that, I've had listening to other music and other experiences in my life away from music. And, or I'm reminded of, in Miles Davis's semi-autobiography, I think it's him talking and somebody else writing it down. But he talked about when he was young, he remembers seeing a blue flame on the stove, and he was so transfixed by this blue flame, and he reached out and touched it, and he burned himself, and his mom got upset and whatnot. But he talked about how that blue flame, it did something for him. It resonated with him, and he moved towards that in his music. And you can hear that. You hear that in his music. You hear that in his playing. It sounds like a blue flame. It sounds like somebody reaching out to a blue flame. And so, I knew that Age of Adeline was an opportunity for me to kind of reach for this enveloping of strings and ambient tones and using acoustic recordings that are manipulated, and using synths and pads to kind of create this really ethereal kind of texture. And So when I saw the material and I knew what Lee Krieger, the director, was going for, I was all in. And to me, it was like melodic, large scale ambient music in a way.
You know, and again, you've done so many kind of really quirky, and it seems you kind of again reinvent your sound with, you know, doing the indie films. I mean, I loved House of Tomorrow, The Only Living Boy, New York. Again, I love Burnt, which is one of my favorite cooking films as well, and even Master Cleanse, which is one of the more insane kind of monster gestalt movies I've watched. And again, the sound for all these is really pretty completely different.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you know, I think that there's composers that they've found their sound and they tend to do that a lot in scores. And when that's an orchestra, you have so many different things that an orchestra can do. But if you hear a score from Thomas Newman or from, you know, John Williams or Silvestri, it's like a lot of these guys' scores, it sounds like them. And a big part of that is that it's a similar choice of instruments and a kind of similar approach. And you know, for me, I always look at it as an opportunity to learn something new. And it's like, okay, I'm gonna learn more about accordion on this score, and we're gonna use accordion. Or I think I have a big appetite for learning, so these are always excuses for me to try something new. So I'm never really afraid of that. And for better or worse, you know, I don't know how, if people can hear me in all of these disparate scores. And I've certainly had moments of feeling like, oh, am I throwing the net too wide? But I think as I get older and I work more, I think things are starting to come into focus, and it's kind of a really great process. I just finished up a film now, and I feel like I'm starting to tie a lot of these things together and getting bigger canvases to work on. And it's great. You know, I mean, if it was just the same thing, I think I'd get bored.
I mean, on that end, I have to give a shout out to actually one of my favorite films that you've scored that I wish more people would have seen, especially because it's so relevant now. And I think it's one of your strangest scores is Captive State.
Oh, thank you.
Where aliens take over the Earth, except everyone loves them.
Yeah. Well, by force, perhaps, but yeah, it's that film. I was really excited. I mean, the subject material in that is great, and that's another good example. We knew that we were going to use orchestra, and we were going to use electronics, and there was a lot of recording individual instruments and processing them and finding little clips of their recording and manipulating them and reversing them and chopping them up and then using that as a basis for something else. And we had a lot of fun. That was actually the mixer that I did Reveries with, was the mixer on that, and the recording engineer. We recorded that all in London with the London Contemporary Orchestra, which is a young group, and they've developed a lot of their own kind of, they're like a band. And they've done stuff with Mika Levy and Johnny Greenwood and Jed Curzel. And, you know, I think they're at the front of a vanguard of kind of a new vibe. And so I recorded with them, and yeah, we mixed in London, and yeah, we had a great time. And I wish more people, you know, saw that film and discovered that score, because yeah, I had a lot of fun. I was pretty proud of that one.
So what can you tell us about what is ahead for you?
Well, I just finished up a film with Sean Levy called The Atom Project. And yeah, it's starring Ryan Reynolds, and I'm very excited. And there's another film that I'm in the middle of right now that I'm also incredibly excited about. This is 2022 is it's going to be a really great year. I'm very excited about these projects and the filmmakers that I'm working with and where they want me to go. And it's a really exciting time. So I'm happy.
Well, I mean, obviously, Ghostbusters is a deserved Munster smash hit. I mean, are you just surprised that people are just going back to the theater? That the critics obviously have no dicks, but the fans love love this movie, and I love it along with them. I mean, are you just? I imagine you must be pretty elated with how well the film has done, especially in the portents it has for you. Just kind of going on this trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, you can never tell. It's funny. When I did Foxcatcher, and Foxcatcher, there were other composers involved. So the score had cues from a few different people, but I was really hoping that would have kind of opened up a gate to doing more of this, restrained piano-based kind of austere Arvo Pardian world of material. And I think it has trickled out, but it's taken a number of years, and sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes time for music to find its way out there. So I really have no expectations. I have no idea how Ghostbusters is going to affect my future. These days, I don't really think about it too much because it's all out of my control, and we'll just see what the waves bring in every morning. And but I know that I was incredibly lucky to have been in this position, and I never expected that Jason would make a Ghostbusters film, and that I would be working with Jason, and that we would kind of have this collaboration that we do. But we work so well together. We had a great time, and I hope that we continue. I think we will. And so let's see. Maybe we'll do some more busting of ghosts. We'll see.
I guess, if there's just like one moment of the film that reduced everyone to a pile of green slime, it was the again, back to Rogue One, the Princess Leia-like appearance of Harold Ramis. I mean, was that the most important part of the film to score for you, just with the emotion in that whole sequence?
I think it was definitely the moment that everyone was the most concerned about. Jason was the most concerned about, and I was concerned about, because we knew what we needed it to be. We knew that we really wanted to move people, and that it had to be this very emotional moment. And it's happening in a scene that comes after all of this action, and then the old Ghostbusters are there, and Egon is there, and they defeat the bad guy, and there's just so much going on. So we knew that the film was going to end with this kind of dramatic thing, but you kind of suddenly get there, and oddly enough, I think by the time I left that for last. It was one of the last things that I did, and I think that Jason and I had really found the vernacular of the film, and I felt, I had been working out in the gym of Afterlife, and felt good about the kind of level of control I had working with that material. So actually, that one, it took a long time, and especially because when you're writing to this degree of specificity in the mock-up, the programming takes a long time, and I was doing the programming. So it's like every note has to be right, and these cues take a long time. But we didn't actually go through that many versions. I think the first thing that I gave him was pretty close, and then Jason came over and we workshopped it, and it was done. So it's one of those things where there's a lot of anxiety, but then as soon as Jason kind of heard the direction, which was like 80% there probably on the first go. I think, I don't know if Jason ever watches this, maybe he's like, no, you did 10 versions of that, but I'm pretty sure it was just one main version, and then we did revisions. And I felt like we got it. So lots of stressing about it, but in the end, when it came, I felt ready, and there were other scenes that were more challenging to nail than that one.
So I guess to wrap up our show, final question for you. If Gozer the Destructor showed up and you had to think of one thing for him to appear as, what would it be?
Oh man. Oh gosh. Ben and Jerry's Chunky Monkey ice cream, because if I'm gonna die, might as well it be delicious.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for joining us at at Film Music Live, Robert. Get the Ghostbusters Afterlife score on Sony Records, with the movie now busting everywhere in theaters. Thanks to our show's producers Dale Turner and Mark Northam, and special thanks to Mark Banning, Ray Costa, Lana Lang, Ryan Manzi, Mary Grace Oglesby, and Dan Goldwasser at Scoring Sessions. And be sure to join us next Monday, the 29th at 1 p.m. as Harry Gregson Williams talks about fighting the last duel with the House of Gucci. We'll see you then. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, man. It's a pleasure.